This conference will now be recorded.
Well, first off, Eric, super appreciative you're jumping on the podcast and excited to talk about the topic that we're going to be talking about today that I know is so close for both of us.
Thank you so much for having me, man. And I'm very much proud of you as a friend, I would say, for sharing the way that you did.
Well, I appreciate it, and certainly what you've done was an inspiration to be able to do that too. So back at you a little bit. So you can let the audience know a little bit for those that don't know you. What's your background and your journey to your current role with We're All a Little Crazy, and what are you accomplishing with that?
Yeah, let me try and do that much quicker than I normally do. So the long and short of it is I worked in professional sports for 15 years, starting at the NBA league office and then going through multiple positions with NBA and NHL teams to the point where 6 months into my tenure as chief revenue officer with the Florida Panthers, the rug was basically pulled out from underneath me. And I started to become dysfunctional as a human being, is the best way I could describe it. Couldn't put sentences together, couldn't look at my staff in the eye, couldn't run meetings, could barely pick out shoes out of my closet. And I realized something was up, obviously. And I went home to New York from there, where my family's from. And for 2.5 years, was taken through about 50 different psychotropic drug combinations, being told that this is the only way that I was going to get better. Where for that 2.5 year period, I was laying in a bed, staring at the ceiling, not watching TV, not listening to the radio, not answering friends' calls because I was literally a vegetable. I was dead to the world. Things had just slowed down on me so much. And I tried TMS therapy, ECT therapy, where they shock your brain for 12 sessions, and none of those things worked for me. And ultimately, I ended up meeting a practitioner who practices what's called integrative psychology. And she taught me the mind body connection of how breathing practices and yoga and meditation help to work out of our system stress and trauma that builds up. And I never thought of the term stress and trauma as something that affected me. But the background to the story is growing up, I had an older brother who had leukemia twice, septic shock from the second leukemia treatment, was in a coma for 3 months from that septic shock, woke up and needed a shunt put in his brain to drain out the fluid. His kidneys failed and needed a kidney transplant from my father. Broke his femur bone and was in a body cast for a year. Had another accident where he flew out of a Jeep, landed on his head, lost partial vision in his eye. And then I had 3 close friends when I was 29 years old that all passed away in the same year. And so when I explained that to this woman, she basically said to me, "You have PTSD." And PTSD standing for post-traumatic stress disorder. And my immediate response was, well, if I have PTSD, who in this world doesn't have some form of PTSD if it's based on our life experiences? I know we're not all servicemen and women, but we've all been through the loss of loved ones, loss of jobs, disappointments in jobs, disappointment in not making teams, bullying when we were younger, getting into fights, you name it, the list is a mile long. And those are all stressful and traumatic situations that build up in our system. And if we don't do anything about it, they take up space in our brain. They take up space in our whole body. And it lives there. And so for me, in living there, is so much had built up that it now shut my system down. And so I shared that story, funny enough, on LinkedIn because I really wasn't much of a social media person. And the openness just of sharing, it's not because I'm Mike Lupica or Edgar Allan Poe. It's just because the details of what I shared, I guess, resonated. And it was read by 100,000 people in that first week. And I had over 400 calls from as far as China coming in. And what that showed me was this is an epidemic. This is not something that is unique to just, a certain group of people. And that was the moment where I decided, well, I've worked in sports my whole career. I have these sports contacts. I guess I now, by default, also have the credibility of having tried all these treatments, what doesn't work and what does work to actually heal our system when we deal with all this stress and trauma. Can I combine the two? And so the idea was to create an alliance, first of athletes, but now extending to musicians and actors, people with platforms, basically, who can talk individually about how they got there, meaning their mental health was affected, in their own brand type of way, but tie it together with a common theme message. And our hashtag is same here. Same here standing for I've dealt with challenges in my life. You've dealt with challenges in your life. Those challenges affect our mental health. If that's common to all of us, why are we not talking about it? So we developed that. We developed a sign language sign that goes with same here. And we've now taken it to where we're going to colleges, going to high schools, going to sports teams even, different corporate offices. And we're actually taking what has been the groundswell in the media of more people talking about it and saying to really burst this wall down, we have to talk about symptoms and solutions face to face with people, as opposed to just I have this disorder and stopping there. So that's really, a long story short, believe it or not, of how I arrived here. And I get, so much joy. We were talking about it, another day and before this, out of the joy that you get out of helping people and changing people's lives and even potentially saving lives, that as much as there's a missing of sports that's involved in the camaraderie of being in the playoffs or even the potentially winning a championship, it's very much replaced in such a rewarding way by helping other people.
It's such an incredible story, and obviously, there's a part of it that I absolutely am along the same way with. And so, can you talk about? You said a phrase that I think is really important: break this wall. So,
Yep.
for those that aren't more intimately familiar with what that wall is, what is that wall that you're talking about?
So, coming out of what I had been through for that 2.5 year period, I started to look at why was it that I was given these options for treatment and I didn't know any better. I didn't know where else to turn. And this wall is this stigma and this lack of education that exists around mental health. And then I dug deeper and I was like, well, at this point, this was before the Kevin Love story, before the DeMar DeRozan story, before the Carson Daly story. This was more in the era of like Prince Harry and Meta World Peace, Brandon Marshall. And I looked at their stories and I saw the way that the media covers mental health is that they did a couple things. One, they had a formula, which is celebrity name plus disorder name plus some form of erratic behavior or tragedy in some cases, unfortunately, like with Kate Spade or Anthony Bourdain. But that's all they tell. And we on the outside who don't think we have mental health complications or that mental health is not a topic for us, we look at those stories and we say, oh, there are those poor people who have those disorders or who we lost to those disorders. And it totally creates this category of what also nonprofits in this space have been talking about for so long, I think, unfortunately, but separating us by saying 1 in 5 people have disorder, thinking that that means that a lot of people are going to realize that a lot of people are affected by this. But in fact, I think psychologically does the opposite. It tells 4 out of 5 people, this is not a topic for you. You don't have to be interested in this. And what that does is it stops people from actually opening up and hearing the topic, listening, reading about it. And so, when I read your story and I was saying to you how great it was that you shared what the day-to-day was like and the symptoms that you felt, that's the only way we're going to break this wall down, is because if we keep just talking about the 2 Ds, disorder and diagnosis, and we don't talk about the day-to-day, the 2 S's, symptoms and solutions, we're not going to be able to break that wall down, where we give people real knowledge that mental health is for everyone and affects everyone. And here's ways that you can take charge, learn about it, and actually heal yourself, because you can actually take control over it and not just pop a pill and pray for it to get better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we discussed this a little bit, but, we work in an industry that, almost exacerbates these things, if you're challenged with them in some way. Because of the amount of hours you have to work and because of the amount of games that you have to work, and especially on the sales side, having to do all those things and be able to perform and still be able to sell tickets, and a lot of times not being able to be given great direction in terms of doing that, why I've got a career as a sales trainer. So can you talk a little bit of what are the challenges that people in the sports industry face that can amplify some of these issues? Because I think that's an important conversation, because I think this and I know this. A lot of people don't think about these on a day-to-day because they get so wrapped up in it. Maybe sports is the only profession that they've been been in so far that they don't understand that, what we do, as cool as it is a little bit abnormal.
Yeah, it's a great question and something that's so important for us to talk about, right? So, interestingly enough, we just had the NBA player Derek Anderson with us at Michigan and Indiana, and the question came up to him: "Hey, Derek, are these players, these professional athletes, are they still carrying the stuff around that they've had from the beginning of their life, the way that you've described it, that they've experienced over the course of their lifetime once they get to the NBA?" And then Derek just started laughing, and he's like, hey, when you're carrying that bag doesn't go away unless you take the clothes out of it, right? Like, just because you're getting $1 million check doesn't mean that it goes away. So now let's take that analogy and let's talk about it about a sports salesperson. In a way, we're very privileged, right? We get into this industry that is this sexy industry that everyone wants to get into who is a sports fan. And it's like, this is my dream job. I'm working for that logo there that I've been looking at my whole life and thinking about in such high regard. And so just because we get that position, that doesn't mean the bag that we've been carrying around for 20 some odd years up until that point goes away. Yes, it's an awesome feeling to get that first position, but we still haven't dealt with our collective shit, so to speak. So when we talk about the buildup of stress and trauma, the reason I always tell my story from the standpoint of what I witnessed with my brother and my friends passing away is that that's a microcosm of an example of how, as society, we deal with things growing up. And if we don't deal with those things, they stay with us. So now, bank that for a second that you've got that going on and you're carrying that bag. Now, all of a sudden, you go and you have this job in professional sports. Well, a job in professional sports is competitive because everyone wants to get to the next level. It's a small world where everybody knows each other because you're all going for those same positions, and we go to conferences and we're sharing best practices. And you have minimum requirements to meet for hustle categories. And you look at how that adds up, and then you say, oh my God, now not only do I have to be the best at what I do to get to that next level, I have to do it harder and longer than anyone else because I have to show effort and energy above everyone else to prove that I'm worthy of that next spot. What ends up happening is this happened for me, and I didn't realize this until looking back after the fact, is just like that NBA player is going and playing on the court, and that is an escape from that bag that they're carrying around. That's a self-medication tool, whether we realize it or not. We think of those things as like productive, and they are because they do give us a little bit of clear headspace when we're doing things that we love and we're passionate about. But now, again, take that to the example of the salesperson. The salesperson is on the call, they're on the phone, they're having meetings, they're generating revenue for the organization, they're doing things that they're hopefully got into this job for because they're passionate about. But the question is, can work be a self-medication tool in and of itself? And the answer is yes, because I lived it, so I know it. Where the stuff that you have not dealt with in your personal life, the things that you have seen, they remain there in that bag. And when you work from waking up in the morning and getting into the office at 8 o'clock, and in some cases we have a game and you work until midnight, and then you get home and you start it all over again, and you're not focused on taking the clothes out of that bag and emptying that bag to make it lighter on you, all that's happening is you're adding more and more clothes to that bag. It's not going anywhere. And so, in a way, this industry almost feeds us getting to that place even more quickly and burn out more quickly because we're holding on to things that we've had, we're not dealing with them, and we're adding more clothes into that bag as time goes on.
Yeah, it's such a good point too, because I hit rock bottom when I was doing Major League Soccer's National Sales Center, which for me professionally was one of the most incredible experiences of my life, and I'm so grateful for having done it. But at that same time, I was wrapping myself up in this idea that I can't screw this up, I can't screw this up, I can't screw this up, because it's the first national sales center for any sport. And I already had plenty of clothes in my bag, but if this was ever going to work in any way, shape, or form, a lot of that was falling on me. And it was that thing where it was someone who had found a way, even through the NBA league office and through some other opportunities in sports and before sports, I had been able to keep at least a pretty productive work-life balance. All of a sudden that got thrown so far out of whack because that pressure that I'd been putting on me for years and years and years just really crescendoed when I hit that national sales center point.
And isn't that really interesting? Because like what you're saying rings home with me when I think about my position with the Panthers. Is like, okay, I'm getting this spot as a chief revenue officer. They hired a CEO who was around my age. They gutted out the business operations and they were letting us build it from scratch. And so it's like kind of like you, it's this brand new opportunity. And so you're thinking to yourself, wow, even the effort that I put in before to get here, I need to put even more effort into this now because look at this opportunity that I have. And work-life balance is a good name for it, but within work-life balance, even if you're getting the personal time, you got to make sure what you're doing with that personal time is productive in taking the clothes out of that bag. Because
100%.
if the personal time is just going out with friends, let's say, or, just going to the gym, which I know is healthy, but it's not stuff to actually empty the clothes out of that bag from a mental health practicing standpoint, which we could talk about. The thing is that balance isn't really getting balanced for us.
No.
It's just that yes, we're spending a little less time in work if we're smart about it, but how do we spend the most productive time out of work?
Yeah, and I think it's taking that responsibility as an organization. I know from some of our challenges we've had to remind young sales reps to make sure that they're finding ways to, especially if they've moved in from out of town. There's so much pressure in a lot of those instances. How do we make sure that they find ways to positively connect with the community? Right? Were you a college baseball player? Let's find you a softball team or a baseball league. And I think teams sometimes need to take on more responsibility when it comes to supporting reps to what's going to be a very disruptive change in their lives, especially if they're moving. But even if they're in town and staying in the same place, it's going to be disruptive when you go from 0 to 60 very, very fast. And I was lucky I had some perspective at CEB. But getting all of a sudden to the NBA league office where everyone was hurry up and wait, and then all of a sudden going to teams, it was just like things were moving so fast. So when I look back, it's very easy for me to see some of those cues as to I didn't have to hit rock bottom. I could have seen this. When you're thinking about a young salesperson, what are some things that you could go back and tell them? Here are some things to look out for to make a preemptive strike as opposed to waiting to where you and I got.
Yeah. Well, even before going into the symptom side of things, I think in terms of analogies, but the really interesting thing is like if you had a really sore throat for 3 days, you'd get to the point where you're like, this is uncomfortable. Even if you're a stubborn bastard like I am sometimes, you'd be like, I'm going to the doctor to get this looked at so I could get my antibiotics to get rid of this strep throat that I have. If you twist your ankle and it hurts, again, you could be stubborn and say, it'll heal on its own. And then after a while, 3 days, it's not getting any better. You're going to the doctor and you're getting it looked at. You might get an x-ray or have them just test it out to make sure you didn't tear any ligaments. When it comes to our mental health, we put it on the back burner. We're like, when we're not feeling great, we're like, things just aren't clear right now. It'll eventually improve and I'll get clearer. And the question is, why are we allowing that to happen, right? So for me, thinking back to literally like my early days working in sports, and I'm honest about my activities, so to speak, outside of work. I never used alcohol as a self-medication tool, but I did use it as a recreational tool. Like I enjoyed going out on the weekends and socializing with friends. So the first thing that I noticed, and the reason I bring up alcohol is I want you to realize how I use it as an excuse, is when I would come into the office, I'd go like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and I'd realize in those 3 days, I wasn't thinking as clearly as I'd like. I had this cognitive fog. And I would justify it by saying, oh, maybe I went out too hard on the weekend before and I didn't give myself a chance to rest enough. Meanwhile, I spent most of Sunday watching football on a couch. There's no way a hangover lasts for 3 days like that, right? But
Yep.
I didn't realize it was this buildup of this anxiety and these mental health complications that were in my mind and these things that I hadn't dealt with that was causing that cognitive fog. So I'd say one of the first signs is if your ability to think and act clearly as you have in the past, whatever that past is, that's a big sign right there. Another sign is the ability to wake up and jump out of bed and get your day started if you're waking up and it feels like it's a chore, like there's something holding you down, like there's a lead blanket on you to get out of that bed. When you're going to pick out your clothes, are you clearly thinking about what shirt am I wearing? What shoes am I wearing? If that's not quickly coming to mind, that's another sign right there, because we're wired to go towards the things that are motivating and helpful for us, that we're going to be excited about for the day. When we're noticing those things are going away, that's a clear sign. Another thing is things outside of work itself. So if you played on a basketball team recreationally and you're not as excited about going and playing, or when you come home from work at night, instead of it just being generally tired, you're saying, I want to close the door and kind of just shut things out right now because I'm overwhelmed. It's another sign right there. And so there is that fine line to, I've overworked myself and I'm a little bit just tired in terms of physically tired, versus, wow, what I'm noticing in terms of my interest level and my desire to be around and do things has gone away, or even has gone down a little bit. That's really a sign for you that something's up here.
And what's that first step? What's the first thing that someone should do when they start to feel some of these things come on?
Everyone handles it differently, right? So here's the interesting thing. When we get sick, going back to the example of the strep throat or bronchitis, we know to go to our general practitioner, our family doctor, to go get it checked out, to get a strep test, or to get our lungs looked at, to get that medication. When it's mental health, like there's not that same starting point for everyone. And so I always say, one is acknowledging that something is going on, and acknowledging it means telling someone in your friend or family group that, hey, I've noticed things are a little bit different here. Okay, have you noticed anything in me? Okay, if not, hey, I just want you to know I'm feeling different than I did before. That acknowledgement goes such a long way when you put it out there. It's almost like, I kind of describe it going back to like sales training days. It's like when you do the I, my statements and then you roll back to everyone else what they just told you in your needs assessment. What you're doing is you're taking that information of what's going on in your head and you're putting it on a silver platter, and you're almost backing the person into the corner with it, and you're saying, this is what's going on with me. So that's okay. You need to find those people in your life that you can share that with. From that point, where do you go? There's so many places. So some people choose, if it's not at that bad of the situation, we've got an area on our website called TSRR, Trauma and Stress Release and Rewiring, where there's like 15 different practices that you can do on a daily basis to start to rehab your central nervous system out of those experiences that you're having, and literally take control back. But that's for the people who want to do it on their own and feel strong enough to do it on their own. For other people, you know, it is talking to a therapist. When I say talking to a therapist, what I would caution is, you want to find a therapist who's going to help you work these things out of your system. What we're finding is, as it pertains to traditional, like Freudian talk therapy, where you sit on a couch, person in a white, jacket, and they're just asking you about your past over and over and over and over again for weeks at a time, that ends up being malproductive, because you're just re-ingraining the trauma over and over again of what you've experienced. You want someone who's going to give you practices on their own, similar to what you can find on our website, to say, here's the way you work them out of your system. So I threw a lot out there in terms of a lot of options, but that's because there are a lot of options. But I guess I would say, think of it like, if you put on weight and you wanted to lose that weight, you would know that you could go to the gym and you could work out with weights. You could work out with an elliptical, with a treadmill, with a rowing machine, swimming. And you know what? All those things are good. You can eat better. All those things are good. Each one is going to be better for different people based on how their metabolism is and how their body works. Well, our brain chemistry is very similar. Each one of these practices is going to work differently for us. So just think of those options as just exactly that, options. We're going to find the ones that work for us, and we're going to lean towards those and use those to improve what we're feeling.
Yeah, and specifically for me, a couple of things that I started doing, across the course of that time was, I loved playing basketball and I loved playing baseball. So I worked to find, like, I'd wake up at 5:30, 5:15 in the morning to go play basketball in the mornings when I was back in Connecticut at my own high school. I went and played softball. I'm playing softball again. when I was younger, I was very connected to the church, and I found a church that celebrates now. And I think all those connections have, I pushed them aside when I was working a lot in sports, directly for teams. I said those things aren't important. When the reality was, to me, those things were critical. Like when I was in my best place, doing those things were a huge part of what I was doing at that time. And, I got away from them because I said, the job is important, or this is important, or this is more important than that. And what I didn't do is prioritize myself during that time.
And that's, like calling it TSRR, trauma, stress, release, and rewiring. Playing softball, going to your church, being involved in activities, and identifying that those things are important to you during that downtime that you make sure to carve out for yourself, that is stress and trauma release and rewiring right there, because those things can be meditative. Really, when we think of meditative, certainly there's meditative states that we can get into, but essentially, like, to really break it down in a very elementary way for everyone, is we have a somatic part of our nervous system that is the thinking, feeling, touching, tasting part of our system, where it's on fire all the time. And especially these things that we're talking on right now, these cell phones, it makes our somatic system even more on fire, because we're constantly looking at what emails coming in, what deadline do I have, what work thing do I have to get back to, what had happened on social media, who liked this post, who followed this post, who responded to me on this post. Well, what's happening there is our brain is constantly working and working and working and working. Our system, our body is a system. It's just that. Just like a car runs on fuel and a computer runs on electricity, our brain and our body works on energy, the food that we eat and the oxygen that we breathe. If we are using that energy up, thinking and thinking and thinking over and over and over again, we have no energy left for what our body does with our autonomic nervous system, which is rest and repair. Things like our immune system and our heart rate and our blood pressure and hormones. Like, those are the things that keep us healthy. Yet we're exhausting ourselves by saying this job is so important and thinking all the time all about it, that we don't give ourselves that rest to allow the rest of our body to be healthy. And you probably experienced this too when you were going through it. Like, when you're in that phase, you end up going to sleep exhausted, and you wake up even more tired than when you went to sleep, even though you sleep for 8 hours, let's say. You're like, how is that possible? It's because there wasn't enough energy reserve to actually refresh the body while you were sleeping and get you back to the point where I'm ready to attack the next day.
It's really funny you mentioned that, because I sit in my office and I actually have a picture staring at me of myself when I was 200 pounds at the National Sales Center, and I'm 5'7". I looked like a Charlie Brown character. Everything was round, and I think it's you are 100% right. It's that never-ending state of being tired, and the only way that I felt alive a little bit was working individually with those sales reps, and that's a huge problem, because all of a sudden that addiction to doing that job and working with the reps, that's what got me to be spending 12 to 16 hours a day, and all of a sudden it just becomes this vicious cycle of the pressure on me to do the work, doing the work, leaving, feeling that pressure, eating badly, all those things just fed in one after another until, like I said, all of a sudden, I got this dog to rescue, and it finally happened. And, it was one of those moments where the reaction from my friends wasn't like, oh, great, Brett got a dog. The reaction was like, is the dog going to be okay? Like, are you going to kill the dog? And I was like, this isn't good. Like, this is like, there's so much wrong about this right now that I need to make sure that I'm going to be good, that I'm going to handle this well. And it was one of those things where I just saw and took a step back, and it was about the time that I had my best friend's wedding coming up, and I was like, I can't be 200 pounds at my best friend's wedding. I need to be able to be here for this dog. And to pick yourself out of it in that moment was great for me, but it was still one of those experiences where, like, man, I missed so much time along this way, that I really could have been proactive about it.
Yeah, but I think the beautiful thing is like the perspective that you gain by looking back on that is awesome because now you were asking the question at the beginning, like how do you notice those things? There,
Yep.
there are your markers right there, right? Like when you're starting to eat in an unhealthy way and you're working too much, it's not just that like, oh, I'm having cravings for junk food. It's part of this cycle that begins with work's the most important thing. It's the only thing I got to focus on. It's the only thing I got to do now, and everything else kind of follows from there because your mental health is taking a dive. Everything takes a dive at the same time with it.
Yep. And I want to make one transition here because I think it's really important because, the more I've been able to, to clear myself in terms of how I look at things and how I approach things and how I teach and talk about things, but it goes hand in hand a little bit with, what I see, when we look at, the challenge in professional sports right now is this empty seat problem, right? Like, every professional sports league is having their challenges when it comes to attendance, some more so than others. Some are being propped up by expansion clubs. But the reality is we're having this disconnect between fans and front offices. A lot of times, they want to blame it on weather or they want to blame it on a lot of other things. But in a lot of ways, I mean, you can agree or disagree with this, but I think we put so much pressure on young sales reps to make sales that it hurts the relationships that we have with fans because that's the fans' intro into a front office and a look at how a professional sports team is run. And when everything is about maximizing every single person, getting every dollar from every person,
Yep.
it becomes like a young salesperson is almost being trained to look at them like, you'd sell Cutco knives or how you'd sell vacuum cleaners or how you'd sell insurance, as opposed to making sure that we take a step back and always having this idea that what we sell is such a positive and uplifting thing that when we make it too hard, we hurt that relationship with the fans. And that pressure that we put on young salespeople is only going to hurt them both physically and mentally, but it's also going to hurt that relationship that we have with our fans. True or false?
Completely true. And it's funny, like that mentality was our training mentality all along, even before thinking about it from a mental health standpoint, because you want a customer who is getting involved with your product because it's fulfilling a need for them. So, I know you do a ton of sales training and have done a ton of sales training. Obviously, Bob Hammer, who was on my staff for so long, and now he's built out his business. Always at the beginning, we thought about needs assessment instead of getting the sale on the first call on the phone to make it churn and burn to get to the next person. It was, how are you going to help this other person on the other end so that what we're bringing to them is of value, right? And so that value might be time with your family. That value might be an ability to spend time with your customers. Okay. That value might be date night with you and your wife, as opposed to that value always being coming out and enjoying a hockey game or coming out and enjoying a basketball game because the team is good or this is the hot place to be. There's certainly people with low-hanging fruit that want to get in just because of the sport itself. But if instead you build a relationship over time with someone where they are purchasing your product because it's bettering their life in some way, as opposed to it just being about the sport alone, that's a fan that's going to want to stay with you through thick and thin. And we used to reward salespeople based on getting appointments and getting face-to-face more so than just selling right away on the phone. And, getting into the really nitty-gritty dynamics of it, I sometimes got scared of when a sale happened that quickly, like, are we selling to a broker? And is that really what it's about? Because I almost think like getting people to buy that quickly, it's almost like, why would people purchase that quickly if you're having a pushy salesperson trying to get them in on a product right away? It's going to take a relationship build to get a real fan built up. So, yeah, I mean, I'm completely in agreement with you that I would rather reward people who build up a funnel based on relationships, and then based on those relationships and showing what the product can do for an individual or a business. That's the best way to sell, as opposed to how many can I get in today specifically to buy right now.
Yeah. And I just, I look back at so many sales reps and you wonder, you ask this question in your head and it's just, how could they not get their personality into the phones? Like we hired this young salesperson and they just have so much struggle. Like we saw how big their personality was and they struggle, to get that into the phones. And, I think that needs to be a self-reflection on each manager and director to be able to say, well, what are we doing that's keeping them from being able to, get that personality in the phones? Is it mandating that they make 80 phone calls a day? Is it, mandating a certain amount of talk time? Is it the way that we're training? And not putting that responsibility on a young salesperson who's never done anything before, but instead, turning that responsibility around on our organizations to say, well, if we thought this much of this person, what's going on that we can't get as much out of them as either one of us would have hoped?
Well, when we hired these people, we hired them because they themselves are a brand. They stand for something. Like, I think back to former reps of mine, and I could still think of like what niche they carved out for themselves. So Kyle Pottinger, who's an intern when we hired him with the Phoenix Roadrunners, and now is the VP of Sales and Service for the Suns. He became the church guru. Like, that was his personality, was talking about how when he grew up, as a young kid coming through the church system, and that was his personality that came across on the phone. We had a guy, Andrew Patillo, who would not stop talking about Penn State because he went to Penn State and he loved the school so much. There's something about each of us that makes us unique and gives us our passion as people beyond just a salesperson. And when you allow that passion to come out, what that does is that opens up the other person, the other end of the line, to connect with you as a human being, as opposed to a salesperson versus a prospect. And the connection doesn't always have to be one-to-one. Not everyone went to Penn State, but most people went to college. So when you talk about your passion for Penn State, it all of a sudden opens up the conversation. Oh, my daughter's going to college right now. Or, hey, I went to school at XYZ. We played Penn State all the time. That type of connection is what really grows a real personality on the phone between the sales rep and the person that we're trying to help with the product, more so than thinking of like, okay, we're trying to sell this person today on this many seats. Let's get them in.
Yeah. We, it was always funny, that was something that we really took to heart, when we had the 2 really successful years with the Columbus Crew. We wanted, especially young reps when they're calling businesses for the first time, we wanted them to have a natural connection to those businesses. So one of my favorite ones is we had a kid who worked in bowling alleys when he was in high school and college, and he ended up selling season tickets to, I think, 6 or 7 bowling alleys around Columbus. And a lot of it is, we can teach that. If you swam growing up, you might work in basketball, but let's put together a swim night. And that swim night is going to be successful because of you. It's not going to be successful just because a swim night would be successful. If someone else ran it, it would probably sell 10 tickets. But if it sells 400 tickets, it's because of that person and the energy that salesperson brings. So a lot of it is, making sure that we work with reps. And, this is a huge part of my sales training, is to work with reps to understand what are the things you like, what are the things that you're passionate about, and how can you spend lots of time selling and talking so you don't have to get to that place where you're like, I've got to make another phone call today because my numbers are down. You want reps who are running around that feel empowered all the time.
Well, it's interesting you bring up like the calling businesses part of it, because I think for young sales rep, that becomes the most uncomfortable call, because what we think of on the other end of the line is we think of this grizzly old veteran CEO that we're talking to. But if we can instead think of this grizzly old CEO as someone who has a personal life themselves, someone who has kids or a family in some way, brothers and sisters, who themselves was a kid one day, you can start to relate to that person on a very personal level, where you're breaking down the conversation. Now it's no longer 23-year-old sales rep talking to 55-year-old CEO. It's you're both on that same level playing field, connecting on things that are similar between the two of you.
And to take that one step further, one of the things that I always tell reps is that's why product knowledge and knowing your stadium and knowing your ticket mix and knowing your team, all that stuff is so critical, because knowledge is power there too. And I remember, when I was at CEB, when I got promoted to traveling around, my problem when I started was I was like, I'm 25, they're 50, they've done marketing for 30 years, they're the CMO of a Fortune 500 company. what on earth am I going to be able to bring to them? When the light bulb went off when I was working with someone who said, listen, they may know marketing more than you, but you understand CEB better than them. And that's why I think product knowledge is so critical, and it's such an underused part of training. I think a lot of times we just assume reps are going to be able to do it because we hand it to them, as opposed to actually giving them real power to be able to say, you may be a 50-year-old CMO who's been doing this for 20 years, but I know more about our team, our products, and how that helps and supports businesses than you do. So the way that we need to have this conversation is, what is that middle ground between the challenges you have and the understanding that I have about how we can get that across within our stadium? And that's a much easier thing for a sales rep to be able to do than pretend like they know the other person's business.
Completely agree, man. Right on point.
So I want to ask this question, and then this could be, you could give a sales answer, a mental health answer, but if you were going to have a conversation with, Eric, who is getting into sports, whether it's the internships or the first job, what advice would you have given yourself getting into it, that may be something you missed, or may have been something that was good about your experience too?
Look, I loved every day I went in the office. Did I love every second of every day? No. There's certainly politics that are involved and certain things that you get caught up in that get a little bit ugly, As you go up in the sports industry specifically, you're dealing with a lot more politics than you do when you're, entry level. And I wish I would have known that going into the sports world, because you're working so hard to get to a level to then get there, and there's a whole different set of challenges that you face beyond just the product management, the marketing, the strategic business decisions. There's the internal and external to fans politics that are involved as well. But I wouldn't have traded it for the world, because I learned so much. If I would look back on myself, it's self-reflection. It's kind of the same thing that you realize for yourself is I had this myopic focus, just like I did when I played sports, of I want to be the best on the court or on the field or on the ice or in the pool or whatever the sport was. And I was going to go balls to the wall, like completely hard to be the best, not let anyone outwork me. I thought that same mentality once I got into the boardroom. I want to work harder than anyone else. It doesn't matter what, let's say, God-given talent I have for managing or for marketing, for whatever the strategy was that was asked for me to carry out. What I realize now is it's not the amount of hours that you work, it's the way you make use of those hours. And so the best math equation I could give there is, if you're going to work 12 hours in a day from 8 to 8, you might think I would be the most productive if I worked through all 12 hours. And I had to quickly come to the realization after all this happened to me that if I can find 30 minutes in that 12 hours to take care of my mental health and to refresh my mind and to shut things down, I will be more productive in 11 and a half hours than I will be in 12 hours straight. 100%. And that's a hard pill to swallow. It's a hard thing to accept when you're like type A, charging forward, want to get things done, thinking every minute is important. You're like, how could I possibly devote 30 minutes to this? But if I had done that over the course of my career, one, I probably wouldn't gotten to the point of where I did with the PTSD, and two, I would have been even more productive in all those hours that I spent in the office than I ended up being.
Well, and to make almost a straight analogy, you did, as a director and a manager, you did take time out of the week to do sales training, with your sales reps, because you knew that even though that might be a half hour away from the phones, the upside of what was going to occur by making your sales reps better was going to pay off in the long run. And it's the same exact thing when you think about this, the opportunity to step away. One of the biggest pieces of advice that I give to young sales reps, because I used to do this all the time in Columbus, and shame on me, I didn't do it in Houston, but when I was starting to feel those struggles, I grabbed one of my friends who was one of our managers at the time, and I just walk around the stadium and I talk with them. And it was such a good way for me to pull me out of the struggles that I was having, to be able to have a conversation with someone I loved that wasn't totally open about why I was asking him to walk around, but to be able to walk around and talk with someone that I genuinely had a connection with and cared about, to be able to look at the stadium, to recenter, to remind myself, that half hour that I did probably every couple weeks, when I got to one of those places, was such a huge way for me to pull myself out of it during that day. And so when you wrote that article for our site, and when I've seen the stuff on your site, it resonated really strongly, because I remember those times when I was smarter about doing it, and how much it helped in those moments.
Well, the interesting thing is, so like I was totally in the same place you were when we were managing, directing staffs. Is like you're thinking to yourself, if I take them off the phones for 30 minutes and go over this, is it going to take away from that collective time that they would be on the phones? Can we afford that? I was able to realize early enough that no, the productivity that we're going to gain from the knowledge that they're going to gain, because it's product specific and it's training specific, it's going to help them when they get to the phones be even better on the phones. But the mental health piece is a very hard concept to accept, because you're not working on the content of what's going on a day to day. That's why you have to really dig deep and say to yourself, okay, maybe this is not sales and product development specifically, but what it's doing is it's recharging that engine, so that what I'm doing with product directly for the other 11 and a half hours, I'm going to be more productive during that time. So it's like the training piece was almost an easier pill to swallow than this was early on, because I saw the direct connection. Whereas this one, it took me a little while to realize, oh, wow, this is connected in that same way.
100%. It's so good. And so, as we kind of finish up here, I wanted to talk, because, I think one of the things that has really struck me since I put my article out on Monday, we're talking about this on Thursday, obviously the likes and the views and all that stuff are nice, that people are connecting with it, but the individual conversations that I've heard that, people have said, I connect with that, I see that, the specifics I was talking about, what was occurring to me and what was happening while I was doing it, those have been more meaningful than I could possibly put into words. What have been some of those stories and things that have happened to you since you started We're All a Little Crazy that have just been so cool and so uplifting and so positive? And I'm sure there's billions, but if you've got a couple that stand out, that I'm sure that would be helpful.
Yeah, well, being on this college tour right now, it's interesting because we've had a couple of we send a feedback form to everyone. It's wearealllittlecrazy.org/feedback to hear from the students of, we want constructive feedback of how we can get better, how we can improve. And I'm like you with social media, like I don't look at the likes as much. I sometimes look at the comments. If the comments are something more than, hey, this is great, or hey, congratulations on this. Like, I like looking at comments where people are like, hey, that really resonates with me and it helped me in this, and this way. Yep. Or shares are very important to me, because shares mean that someone took that information and believe that it's valuable enough to share with their friends or family in their network. Those two things are really what I get a kick out of, more so than like what is social currency out there, like likes and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
But yeah, it's absolutely the individual conversation. So I'll give you a couple examples. One is on LinkedIn, I got a call, and this is not even like very deep of a reaction, but it's more, it just shows the value of what we put up there. When I'd written my story, I think it was like August of 2017, I had someone call me, because I had put my telephone number in the post. I had someone call me January of 2018. So you're talking about 6 months later. And this guy opens up to me and he says, Eric, it took me 6 months to gather the courage to give you a call, but I wanted to let you know that because of your post, I'm now going and speaking to someone and getting help. And the amazing thing to me about that feedback was, here's someone I had never met before, someone who wasn't like a first connection of mine, someone who didn't reach out immediately. And oh, by the way, I shared my shit like completely vulnerably, yet this person was still afraid for 6 months to even share with me that they were going through something and that this motivated them to get help. Like, that just shows how much these things are important to people to put this out there, that like we don't realize who they're reaching and we don't realize how tough it is for them to open up, but just giving it out there into the universe of old school world, the World Wide Web of people being able to read things, it goes so far. I'll give you some.
one more.
Well,
I don't want to cut you off there, but to be empathetic to that, I think you make such a good point. Like, I conceptualized this article in January and I hit send in October, right? I mean, I think that shows you that I'm still on this journey, right? Like, there isn't
yep.
any part of me that's over what these challenges are, what's happening, but I also know that 6 years ago or even 4 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to, even though I was on that journey to get better. I still wouldn't have been able to hit send on that because it would have been terrifying to think about what people are thinking when that was happening. And it's lessened over time to that point where, I was able to hit send on Monday. And then, instead of just trying to figure out the reaction, I grabbed my dog and I took a walk for like 2.5 hours. And
Wow.
it was one of the coolest moments for me because I walked my stepson to school. I came back, I hit send on it, and I took a walk for 2.5 hours. And it was one of the most Zen experiences of my life because I wasn't thinking about what people are going to respond, what people are going to say. I was like, it's finally a beautiful day in Houston where it's not 700 degrees. And I can just enjoy this experience and not worry about what's happening behind it, what emails are coming. And that's not always going to be all the time with me. There's still going to be days and minutes and weeks that there are going to be struggles, but to know that wouldn't have even been possible 6 years ago after I hit send, to be able to walk away from it like I did was one of the coolest moments I've had along this journey.
Well, and that hopefully people are hearing that and they hear how much helping other people and getting your stuff out there is therapeutic to yourself.
100%.
The term is helping is healing. That's one thing, but then also that those clothes that are in your bag, what you did by putting that out there is you took some of those clothes and you threw it out of the bag by doing that, And so that's a freeing feeling in and of itself. And so, I never push anyone to share their story because I know everyone has a different comfort level and it's going to come at different times. But it is an endorsement to say when you're ready to do it, it helps so much. And I have no qualms in people knowing that I had PTSD. Like, that doesn't bother me in the least. In fact, I think people who share and have been through difficult times because life is thrown at them, they didn't choose those difficult times. Life kind of chose them with those difficult times. And so they had to find a way to rise above it. So we should be applauding those people instead of looking down on them the way that, unfortunately, the stigma in society has. One other story I'll share just because it's a recent one, which I think is really cool, is so one of the schools that we visited was University of Richmond. And, we have a Q&A session afterwards. And so, there's a good number of people who raise their hand and ask questions. And then there's the people who leave the room and you hope to get the feedback form from them. You might not. And in the case where you get the feedback form, it's great. But then there's just some people that leave and you don't know what type of impact you had on them. And so we got an email the day after the Richmond event from a mother who wrote through the website. So this was not a student going on the feedback form that was emailing to them. It was a mother who had been spoken to by a young woman who was a student in the audience. And the mother wrote and said, my daughter came home and spoke to me. I didn't say a word for 40 minutes. She was telling me about this event because I, as her mother, have suffered with depression my whole life. And my daughter said she never understood what I was going through. And now sitting there, she gets it, she understands it. And now she feels a certain different way towards me than she ever has, to where our connection is so much stronger now. And I wanted to reach out and thank you for doing that and find out how I could support your efforts. So it's like to hear that someone is taking what's being said and it's not only helping them, but they're actually bringing it to someone else and it's having a ripple effect. That's really, to me, one of the most rewarding pieces of this is going back to you don't know who you're helping. Not only do you not know who you're helping directly, you don't know who you're helping indirectly as well. I think that is such a rewarding piece of being involved in this type of work that we do.
Listen, like I said, I've only got 2 days work, and so you've got a ton more on me. But that story is so cool because I know the more that I've opened up to people and the more conversations I've had, you start to really understand just how empathetic people really are, and that makes it far easier to have the discussions like we're having today, and to watch that kind of mushroom out through networks is something that's really cool. So we talked about getting up in the morning, and I know that I'm getting up a lot quicker than I used to these days. So what drives you? What's next for you? I know I ask this question all the time at the end of all my podcasts, but I think understanding in this one, what gets you up out of bed now? What drives you? What excites you about what comes next for Eric?
Yeah, I think globally, what's exciting to me, when I say globally, I don't mean geographically globally, although it plays into it, but just big picture globally, is that the groundswell of what started here is people realizing that this same here concept is applicable to everyone. That is what's driving me, because I think that unfortunately for so long, I was one of those dummies. I'm using air quotes right now as I say it, although maybe I am a dummy, but I was one of those dummies who thought, this topic doesn't speak to me. And then when the rug got pulled out from underneath me, I realized I was very much in the wrong. That's what gets me up every day, is enabling people to see that, holy cow, this is not this topic of mental illness and 1 in 5 that's been talked about for so long, but in fact, this same here concept, when carried by multiple people with platforms, organizations such as yours, organizations such as Bob's, organizations such as sports teams, minor league, major league, corporations that we're talking to, now schools that we're going to visit, they can still operate with their individual brands and they can still operate with their individual taglines. But when you tie it together through a same here message, it gets more and more people realizing we're all in this together. So like in a very hokey dokey way, but it's real. It's like we are one tribe in this world, all going through same here challenges, regardless of what our backgrounds are. And I keep thinking to that vision of people feeling connected in that way. That excites me, to make the world feel like one team that's all going towards this collective goal of getting away from stigma and going towards education. To me, that would be the most rewarding thing in the world to have happen.
Listen, I know, having, worked in the industry at the same time as you, I know the sports business industry, misses your direct contributions, but, I also know that what you are doing right now is having such an incredible impact on people, obviously including myself. So I know, myself and lots of people are very appreciative for how you've borne this for the sports business community and allowed this conversation and dialogue to start. And it's such a critically important one, not just, for people like me, but, I think for people like my friends and my family who now have a little bit more clarity into what was happening when all that was occurring and still occurring. So I couldn't be more appreciative about the work you're doing and obviously the time you've taken to help here. And so give some people a chance to know where they can follow you and where they can reach out to you.
Oh, thankful. First off, thank you for the comments. It's humbling. And I think of it very much as a partnership. Like that's the way that I thought of when I worked at teams, is you're sharing with each other. This is the same thing. I want to share with all the folks who are in the industry so we could help make things better for everyone, our reps, our executives, our fans. In terms of following us, so because you can't use conjunctions in websites and social media, instead of it's we are all a little crazy on pretty much all of our social channels. So Instagram, it's we are all a little crazy. Facebook, we are all a little crazy. On Twitter, because of the character limits, it's at all a little crazy. So we can't use the we are at the beginning. And then website is wearealllittlecrazy.org. So, the resources are there to help people. They're there to share stories. They're there to share solutions. They're not there because any of these practitioners or these people who share are getting paid or getting more business out of it. It's meant simply to be a resource. So we hope people can use it and benefit from it.
Yeah, absolutely. So listen, Eric, genuinely appreciate the time. Keep up the incredible work you guys are doing, and certainly talk sooner.
Thanks, brother. Really appreciate it.
Yep.